Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I don't know about you, but my brain is abuzz listening to all these amazing talks. And it's funny because I actually didn't think my talk had a lot to do with the theme of fusion. But as I listened to every single speaker and video, I realized that they all have to do what I want to talk to you about, which is creativity and changing the conversation. Now you have to excuse me, I'm in my sock feet because I sprained my ankle pretty badly last weekend, and so wearing shoes is just a little painful. I am a filmmaker, and in my day job, I produce and direct film, television, and new media. And then in the rest of my time, I engage in community events, creative collaboration, and creating works of art and sculptural installation. So when I say creativity, I think we all know what I mean. We apply creativity across many different fields, and even in the talks here today, we can see how creativity can be applied in furthering fusion technology, in silencing our inner critic, in interpreting a message to creating a run around North America. We're using creativity all the time to problem solve, whether it's in the fields of physics, mathematics, or in art. So what do I mean by changing the conversation? We all have to find meaning in our life, a purpose, what we're gonna do. And you all are at an extraordinary crossroads where you are looking ahead and determining what your future is going to be like. You are under an immense amount of pressure, some of you, to make applications to university, to decide what you want to study, what your career might look like. We all have to do that. We're all looking for a sense of purpose and a higher purpose. So as other speakers have said, and what I really want to encourage you to think about, is everyone is unique. And so life and the purpose of life is finding the expression of who you truly are and finding the expression of the best version of who you are. So I too was a student at Brentwood some 25 to 28 years ago, and I was in your exact same situation. I was trying to figure out what to do with my life once I left high school. Now, I was a pretty good student, but I wasn't the best. And I was an athlete. I played basketball and field hockey, but no one was throwing an athletic scholarship at me. I also loved the arts. I loved drawing and painting, and I did ceramic sculpture. But I wasn't that guy who sat beside me in art class who could draw and sketch endlessly and beautifully. So I knew I was no virtuoso, that I had to choose a vocation that was sort of a basket for everything that I was interested in because I was a generalist. But I also had a deeper calling, and I knew that was I wanted to engage in social change, and I wanted to engage in changing the conversation. Now, what I mean by that is interacting with someone else in a way, or providing a platform or a medium with another person or group of people, or even yourself, that causes a shift in perception, a shift in thinking, a shift in habit, or a shift in action. Now, you may be wondering why. Where did this motivation come from? Why did I have this desire to do that? And I grew up in the interior of British Columbia on a ranch in a remote location between Lytton and Lillooet. There were no social services or really even police. And as a young child, I watched my parents argue. And those arguments would escalate into yelling and then into horrific scenes of domestic violence. And that was really frightening as a child. But I also knew watching them that this kind of behavior seemed crazy to me, that there had to be another way that people could interact, could problem solve, could communicate. I knew it in my heart that this wasn't the only way. And because the inside of my house was so crazy, but I lived on a ranch, I spent a lot of time outdoors. I spent a lot of time outdoors alone and on my horse and in the forest and in the fields. And so I developed an incredible relationship and respect for nature. So another motivation for me was a huge desire to drive the conversation around the environment and our relation to the environment. So there were several pivot points in my life that taught me how creativity could shift the conversation. And I think one of the very first ones was right here at Brentwood. I had the great fortune of being taught by Mr. Gil Bunch, whom this theater is named after. He taught me grade 10 English, where he told us we knew nothing about English and started from the beginning. And he also taught me grade 12 literature. And Gil was so passionate that he would read Kubla Khan, for example, and his face would go beet red and he'd spit on everyone in the front row. Just because he was so incredibly passionate about what he did. But he was also demanding. And he demanded that everyone in his class show up and do the best he could. He demanded that everyone that participated in his theater and his musical theater do their absolute best. And that stuck with me because he also believed in me. He used to say to me, "Oh, Dolman, what are we going to do with you?" Because I would also always get in trouble every year here at Brentwood. Anyhow, I went to McGill University, and another pivot point happened in my very first film class. It was called Film as Mass Media. It was taught by a professor named Ron Burnett. Ron is now the chancellor of Emily Carr University and has been for the last 22 years. An extraordinary guy, and he and I have stayed friends. But he taught this film class, and he showed us this film one day called Hiroshima Mon Amour. And it was this French New Wave film, and I'd never seen anything like it. And it blew my mind. It was about an interracial relationship post-World War II, post-Hiroshima. But the print came, and it was a French film, and it was unsubtitled. And so Ron live translated the film. And there were very intimate scenes between this couple, sexual scenes. And the audience of students, we all started laughing. Well, the next class, Ron came in, and he had written this huge speech, basically giving us so much crap for being cretins, for laughing during this extraordinary work of art. And his passion in his speech and the effect of the film had on me, I knew in that moment that that's what I wanted to do, is I knew the power of cinema and the moving image had the ability to deeply move and transform people. So the next pivot point came when I attended, after I finished school in California, a festival called Burning Man. Now, Burning Man has been called by a philosopher, Daniel Pinchbeck, to be the greatest cultural movement of our time. And when I first started going there, there was a few thousand people, but it's a gathering in the desert where people build art, and they create a temporary community for 1 week. And now it is the third largest city in Nevada when the event happens every year. And I couldn't believe what people were doing, the extraordinary works of art that they created, that they brought just to share with all the other attendees. It was sort of like my head, the top of my head got taken off, and my brain got scrambled and put back on. This was from a year called Green Man. It was an environmental thing, and someone actually welded 2 semi-trucks together, and the inside were filled with plants, and you could crawl up inside it and onto the top of that sculpture. There's art at night, too. Extraordinary use of light and lasers. There's performance art. And it also has a set of principles that it encourages people to consider while they're at the event. Radical inclusion, which means everyone can be involved. Gifting, which means everyone shares. Decommodification, you actually can't buy or sell anything there, and nor is there any corporate advertising, which I think is really important to just take a break from all that stimulation. It's also radical self-reliance. You have to bring all your food and water, and radical self-expression, as you can see through the art. This is a temple. There's a temple that's built every year, and it burns. A lot of the art is burned at the end of the festival or at varying times during the festival. So you can see the scale of this, which was then just burned. And people create these wonderful creations that encourage communal effort, civic responsibility, leave no trace. You have to pack everything out that you bring in. Even when you burn something, you have to take out the ashes. It encourages participation and immediacy, which I think is really driven home by the fact that so much is burned. It really changed the way that I saw the world and instilled in me a deep sense of magic. It actually restored my faith in human beings and what human beings are capable of. That our extraordinary capacity for creativity is what the future is all about. Is that if we apply that creativity, we can get ourselves out of some of the most difficult situations, I truly believe, including global warming, if we apply creative solutions. So I decided I would bring everything I've learned at Burning Man home with me and apply it in my career. So I made a documentary about a radical environmental activist named Paul Watson. He's one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, and he invented a form of protest called direct action, where you actually physically place yourself potentially in harm's way in between what you're protesting. Now, you may not agree with Paul's methods, and many people don't, but I spent 10 years observing him. And what was instilled in me was his sense of passion and his desire to change the conversation about the oceans and our relationship to the oceans and preservation of marine life. And that made me think of something and made me transform and commit to what I call radical engagement. And what I mean by that is often when we see something we don't like or we think is wrong or is full of conflict, we want to withdraw. We want to retreat. We want to step back. And what I've learned in life is that the opposite is needed. We need to lean in. We need to step forward. We need to engage more to create the change we want. We need to radically engage. And I think all of you are such an important piece of that for the future, is that you can't disassociate. We need you to apply yourselves and your uniqueness for our future. So I go to Tofino a lot. I'm a surfer. And a couple years ago, after the tsunami, I started seeing a lot of plastic showing up on the beaches. Small little bits, big pieces, all different stuff. And I was so bothered by this because I'd never seen it before, and I have a little son, and we started collecting all this plastic. And I was like, what am I going to do with this? And people are like, well, why don't you make a collage? And I was like, I don't want to make a collage. I want to do something different. Uh-oh. Crashing. So I decided, and what just came to me in a moment of inspiration was that I was going to create a jar that was a replica of a canning jar, over height, 8 feet tall, that was reminiscent of another time when we used glass instead of plastic. And I was going to fill that jar with all of the plastic I had collected, and I worked with a nonprofit who also collect plastic from our entire coast. They're called Ocean Legacy. I encourage you to check them out. This year they collected 50 tons of plastic from the BC coastline. So I came up with this idea. It just came to me in a moment of inspiration, like Matt. And I wrote up an art grant for Burning Man and submitted it, and I got chosen, and I got a grant. And so I made this jar and sorted all this plastic and asked my community to help me. And that's my son in the very background. And it was incredibly satisfying watching people's reactions. Some people were saddened. Other people were like, oh, look, it's a gumball machine. Only to find inside was a very different story. My husband also made this project, the Orca Project, as a commentary on our local orca population and the fact that it's endangered. So the idea of changing the conversation and radical engagement, I continue to try and apply in my work. So one of my latest projects is a project called Canada in a Day, which I think a number of students here participated in. But I asked Canadians across the country and around the world to video their lives and send me and CTV the footage. And for me, it's an opportunity to have an extraordinary conversation with each other about not only what it means to be Canadian, but the modern face of Canada. Because I still think on our screen-based industries, we have a lot of work to do to reflect what I see as the modern face of Canada, the actual fabric and diversity of our country. And that was amazing. We reached millions of people, and more than 15,000 people submitted videos, which I'm now in the midst of editing into what I call a video time capsule of the modern face of Canada. So another project I wanted to share with you guys, which I think a lot of you are studying, is we are currently in production on a movie called Indian Horse based on the book, which through a fictional character tells the story, the tragic story of how First Nations children were forcibly removed from their homes and really physically tortured through the process of residential schools. And my producing partner on that is a woman named Christine Habler. Her daughter goes here, Anna Singer Habler. And we hope to show you guys that film. But to me, again, it's an opportunity to change the conversation about how we perceive Indigenous peoples in this country and our collective history and how we move forward through truth and reconciliation. So what I learned through the course of my life, because I think when I graduated from Brentwood, I had some lofty goals, like I wanted to change the world. But what I've learned is that sometimes changing the conversation just happens with one person. And I get this feedback sometimes on the different films I've made or different documentaries, and really hit home for me again in creating the Jar of Sand, the art project I showed you, because me and a bunch of my friends went to work with Ocean Legacy to sort all this plastic. And it was an overwhelming amount of plastic, like a huge storage room full of styrofoam. And when you see it in that volume, it's sort of staggering. And so my friends and my son and a bunch of kids, we all sorted bottles and everything and got a lot done. And then I used it in the jar and I went to Burning Man. And a friend of mine who'd come out that day, when we got to Burning Man this year, she said, you know, I just want to thank you because that day sorting plastic completely changed how I see my own plastic consumption. And I hadn't really thought about plastic and where it goes. And when I saw that volume, I decided that I was going to really reduce the amount of plastic I use and really focus on recycling. And I was like, wow, well, for me, if that was what this whole process was about, that is good enough for me. So in closing, what I want to ask you is, I don't expect you to want to change the world. I hope you do. But what I do want to ask you is, how are you applying your creativity and who are you having the conversation with? Thank you.